But I really wanted to start out by talking about what I think of as an ongoing love affair with Scala. Which is weird because I'm not really programming anymore, although for a long time that's pretty much all I did, all I wanted to do. And now I have to think about other stuff, but one of the things I think about is how to really enable people to do the things that they love. And certainly, in this industry, at this moment of time, it's kind of a magical thing because we can really get paid to do the things that we love. And it's a very nice life, and solving problems and engaging with what you do is an incredible privilege. And for me, it's become something of a privilege to enable this to happen. And so GOEThe said we are shaped and fashioned by what we love. And somehow when I'm in Germany, which I am all the time now, Goethe is never far from my mind because he was this incredible aesthete, and he was amazing with language, and he really helped capture the beauty in things. And the beauty in Scala is for me one of the most compelling things about it. It's the thing that really grabbed me at the start. And so, I've been kind of replaying in my head what's my history with Scala. My first Scala Days was in Switzerland when this volcano went off, and I showed up with one change of clothes, and I was stuck in the country for 10 days. And it was basically a total disaster, but somewhat memorable. And somehow this is now kind of an easier experience since I live in Berlin. But it's really great to see so many people here this morning. Thank you for coming out. Giving a non-technical talk at this conference is exciting because some of the best technical talks I've ever seen have been here. So thank you. So what I'm going to talk about, big picture, is what are the kind of conditions that we need to create in order for Scala to really succeed? I think a lot of us kind of watch closely to see how is it doing, and there was a recent story about the TOB index, and there's been a bump, and that seems like good news, and then it's not clear, is that because they changed how the search works and all this stuff? And I feel a little bit qualified to talk about it because I've introduced Scala in a few places. So what I'm going to talk about specifically is, first of all, a little bit about systems theory, and then I want to talk about something that I've never talked about before called governance, which is a word that I have a hard time saying, maybe you do too. And then finally, this idea of accountability. It's a pretty broad audience, and it's going to be hard to connect with everyone. But fundamentally, for Scala to succeed, we need to change our behavior a little bit. And as developers, we need to change how we think about what goes on around developers. And as leaders, we need to think a bit more about how we structure and organize to succeed and to really allow good decisions to be made. And then at the end, I'm going to ask a little something of you. So in some ways, I feel like this Johnny Appleseed of Scala. I kind of got into it in a company, and I snuck it in, and then I took it to another company, and then I took it to a third company. And today, I find myself at Zalando. We're based here in Berlin. This is our 10th anniversary. It's been quite a success story for those of you who don't know it. We're doing 4.5 billion euro in annual revenue, which I guess is kind of a lot. We handle about 90 million orders a year. We have 2,000 people working in tech, and over 100 people working in Scala. I actually found out last night it's hard to figure out the exact number because we have a culture of autonomy and encouraging autonomy, and there's a lot of things going on that we don't always know. But the approach that we took at Zalando was quite different than what I did in my previous company, which was GILT Group. There we made a huge, essentially wholesale change to embrace Scala. And we more or less said overnight, we want the entire engineering team, about 100 people, to start doing this. We all kind of held hands and sang Kumbaya together and said this is the right thing to do. And it was super hard. And I'm not sure I would recommend that approach, to be honest. But it was, the parts that went well were really great. And I wrote a ton of code in Scala at GILT. GILT they still sort of exist. They were purchased, but they were a flash sales site. And every day at noon, we saw about a 50x increase in traffic. So we have these really kind of insane non-functional requirements. And the programming part was pretty hard for anything that faced customers. When I started out with Scala, it was at TomTom, and TomTom was a pretty strict place. I was a little bit of a special employee in that my boss gave me a lot of latitude, and I snuck Scala in, kind of broke the rules. I had to write the service really quickly, and it's quite important for revenue, and I wrote it in Scala, and I deployed it, and I didn't tell anybody that that's what I had done. And the operations people came back to me and said, this is the only thing that's ever been deployed that didn't have any reported bugs, and we want to know what you did differently. And I was like, oops. So I pushed it pretty hard, and it tried to take off. I'm not quite sure how that has worked out. At one point, I saw on the same webpage job ads for Scala developers at TomTom, GILT, and Zalando, and that made me feel pretty good. Like I was somehow making a difference. But I think, one of the things that's become clear through these different approaches is that we really need to be thinking about what's a sustainable way to get something like Scala into a company. It is controversial. It's one of many languages. I'm guessing most people here love it. Some people definitely hate it. I hear from them from time to time. But I think I'd like to believe at least that we're all here because we all agree there is something kind of special about the whole language, the ecosystem. The culture, while a little bit prickly sometimes, is pretty high performing. And there's some really great software now in the world that's been built this way. So I want to actually turn it over to you now, just for a minute, and just ask you, why you love Scala? Just shout out a few things. 1 word, 2 words. What is it, assuming you love it, since you're here? Anybody? Freedom of choice, simplicity, those are great. Sorry? Yeah. Less code. Performance, definitely. Immutability, I love that. Yeah. Okay, yeah, those are all, I pretty much agree with all of that. For me, all those things boil down to something that's like beauty, though, for me. Simplicity, less code. It just, like, when any of those things starts to kind of resonate, I get this feeling, right? That's like, wow, this is actually really great. I wrote C++ for a long time. I think I wrote something like 500,000 lines of C++, and then I wrote Java for a long time, and again, something close to 500,000 lines of Java. And my mantra was I live like I type, which is fast with a lot of mistakes. It was like just producing code was just all I did all day. And it felt great, but after, closing in on 2 decades of that, I was really starting to lose this ability to remember what in that was great. It felt like everything I did that felt clever was overcoming some problem, not sort of contributing to the net beauty of things. Especially in Java, when I remembered, I don't know who does this. Some people I've heard carry code from one job to the next that they're really proud of, and they maybe have a look at that from time to time because of some problem that they solved that was hard that they think they might need again. Just saying. And the people I might have seen do that, it was always overcoming something that just sucked fundamentally. There was no beauty in it. It was like this clever trick that was hard and painful, and it slowed down the important things. We figured out some stupid incidental thing. And with Scala, it was just kind of different. It was like the code that I wanted to carry with me was beautiful. I was proud of it. It was like, wow, it was correct by inspection many times. It was just a totally different experience. And, the world doesn't have to be that way, but it can be that way. And that's, I think, the great privilege of why this is important. But I think, there's a few problems that I've seen now. And, I'm not about to say that when if all you have is a hammer, everything is a nail. It's a different point. What I've seen is that we actually are building a lot of hammers. And we really focused hard on tooling, and that's somehow pleasurable. And tooling is kind of interesting from my view because tooling is very often very high symmetry. And Scala is also high symmetry. In fact, I gave a talk a few years ago at Scala Days in New York on this very topic, that the sameness is kind of interesting and it has an aesthetic, but the things that are really valuable in the world and the things that are truly beautiful are actually not symmetric. The Mona Lisa is not symmetric. And so there's a force that tends to pull us into not necessarily focusing on the real things. We're building a lot of hammers when we should be building houses. And this, I think, is one of the great tricks that we're trying to solve at Zalando, not just through Scala, but how we really organize and think about people and process and how we build systems and how we really try to delight our customers. And Scala is, for me, the best hammer for a bunch of these problems. Okay, so that's kind of my introduction. I wanted to talk about something that a bunch of people lie about on their CVs. And I lied about this on my CV for a long time. And it was a thing called system theory. So I put that I was like an expert at systems on my CV for probably 15 years. And I never actually read a book on systems. And then I went on I like to read, and I actually set up long-term reading goals, and this book popped up on my radar called Thinking in Systems by Donatella Meadows. And it's kind of an interesting book, in part because she died before she finished it, and they published it anyhow. It is that good. And it's a really engaging read. And there's a lot of good stuff in it. But for me, basically there were 4 points in that book that have more or less changed big parts of my life. They've changed how I think about systems, how I think about organizations. And so I want to share those because I think they really fit in nicely to how we need to change how we think in order to really succeed at pushing not just Scala to its full potential, but actually continuing to preserve this amazing lifestyle of what we get to do for money. So basically, there's these 4 things that all systems have in common. Whether it's systems in nature, systems in your car, systems on the internet, if they are successful, they are resilient. And it's essentially almost a universal law that, a system that isn't a little bit prepared for the unexpected will become fragile and fail and actually be a problem instead of kind of serving its purpose. The next 2 I've sort of bundled into one video that I love, which hopefully is good. Successful systems are always composed of self-organizing autonomous agents, and those agents always form structures on demand that really fit the purpose at hand. And whether it is white blood cells and how they organize to attack an infection, or even how a successful company works, you have to compartmentalize things, and then those things have to be able to not only be autonomous, but really form larger structures that can solve harder problems. And the 4th thing is that they always have feedback loops. And somehow feedback loops are kind of like uncomfortable for introverts. And I guess there's a lot of introverts in the room. I certainly am one. But if you're not doing something and getting something back, you're not really part of a successful system. Whether you're creating some value for some customer and trying to understand what that customer thinks, or you're trying to become a better programmer, we're all better because someone better than us helped us out along the way. And this feedback, even there are a lot of ways to think about it, but fundamentally it is just this absolutely essential part of a successful system. And it has to be there. And anything that we do that doesn't include some notion of feedback is pretty likely to fail. And I'm highlighting these because I found that more and more that applying this lens to different things is fruitful. And that when things go well, very often you can sort of identify, yeah, actually it has these attributes, and when they don't, very often you can see that they're missing. So, with that in mind, I'm going to move on to something that I thought I would never talk about in public, which is this idea of governance. I really struggled with this word for the longest time. I didn't really know what it was. I definitely knew that I didn't like it as a concept. And basically, it was like something that had to be tolerated somehow. It was like maybe related to continuing to getting paid. Just to give some context, this is me in 1993. I was like the anti-governance poster child. I was not basically playing with the team at this point, and subverting everywhere I could. But one of my missions is to get people a little bit more comfortable with the idea. A world without governance is totally insane, and it's horrible. And I don't, this reminds me of Bitcoin in some ways. But living in Berlin is kind of interesting because this is a very safe place. Things work. The trains basically operate. It is, pretty much a democracy. The rules of law work. Governance here is working, and it works in a way that makes this a great place for people like me who don't really like governance to live. It was not always like that in Berlin. Similarly, there's another spectrum that's maybe like a place like Caracas, where it's just, you just wouldn't want to live that way. But what I've sort of come to understand, governance is a lot of things. It can be around compliance, it can be around security, it can be around architecture. But in a way, all governance is about, in kind of the day-to-day ways that matter, is it's really enabling people to be more introverted and actually focus on the job at hand. And it means they don't have to talk to each other about every single thing. Now, it turns out talking to each other is quite important, but you want to limit that to the things that really matter. So, for example, with data governance, we have this kind of realization. It's like data governance is middleware, right? It's like in a system that has some data governance, I can use your data without having to ask you what it means. And if you boil it down to its essence, that's all it is, and that's actually fantastic. That enables all this stuff. It means that, as you grow, far, far fewer conversations, redundant conversations are necessary. And it makes working life better. It makes it easier, it makes it faster, and it makes customers happier. It makes businesses more successful. It's a good thing. I spent half my life rejecting this idea that's actually a good thing if you do it right. So if you take only one thing away, I hope it's that you become comfortable when people talk about governance. And there's people talking about stupid ways of governing. That is somehow endemic in our society at the moment. But you can be a force, because it really is trying to help us in some way. Now, part of governance is around architecture. And I spent a lot of my life calling myself an architect. And I did actually read books, and I think I was legitimately an architect. And it is part of governance, but it's a lot of different things. And one of my favorite questions when I interview someone who says they're an architect is to get them to tell me what architecture is. And there's a bunch of answers, but there's a few that I kind of like. You can tell architecture succeeds if you don't have to tell somebody, usually the business, that, oh, oops, that's a great idea. It's just that that's super hard now because we did this other stuff instead, and that's what we did doesn't connect up. Winning in architecture is when someone has a great idea and you say, yeah, actually, that's not so hard. That we can fit that in without breaking the paradigm. Architecture is also about avoiding these one-way doors. There was this kind of period of time in the early 2000s when people discovered, wow, you can evolve a database schema in production. And this was huge, actually, at the time, because, in big companies in the early 2000s and before, there were whole teams that would work for months on these incredible database schemas that were so complicated, and then once they were put in, it's like you were living with that for the next decade. And that was genuinely a stupid way to build software and super painful. And then we figured out, oh, actually, we can save those decisions for later. We don't have to go through this one-way door. And for me, this was an under-recognized triumph of architecture. But getting these things right, where you don't even know sometimes if they're right for years, is incredibly important. Now, some of you may have seen this choose boring technology thing, meme. This went around inside Zalando, and it generated some conversation, because we are not choosing boring technology as a rule. At least, we're not limiting ourselves to boring technology. I would say we have a very healthy approach to when boring makes sense and when it doesn't. And the guy who wrote this is super smart. He's one of the people behind Etsy. They did amazing stuff with PHP. And when I read this, it's like, okay, this makes sense, and I sort of, but I don't like it spiritually, and I can't figure out why. And it's like if it's somehow pieced together, why don't I like this? Why is this wrong? Or maybe is it wrong? Maybe it's right? And I think many of us work for companies. Those companies have to be profitable, otherwise they cannot succeed. And in some sense, it has to be our mission to get them and keep them profitable. But that doesn't mean that we have to only do that. And not only that, only doing that is somehow a very short-term view. We also want to create a sustainable enterprise where great people want to come. We want to succeeding, especially in the very modern era, means innovating constantly on behalf of your customers. If you don't innovate, someone else will and steal them. We all have to be innovating. And so if we take this, okay, what's the most let's call it, Soviet approach to building the simplest, lowest tech version of every single thing that we do? Yeah, that can work, but it's not very inspiring. There are a lot of people who are inspired by the business part, and that's important. There have to be those people, but there also have to be people who are inspired by the beauty of solving these problems. Because we're out there, and we're going to work somewhere, and ideally we're going to work somewhere that can find this right balance of how do we actually keep the aesthetics in mind? How do we keep this idea that it's like, yeah, it is important to be profitable, but it's also important to have style and taste. There's so many different ways that we could do it, and so many ways it is being done. Let's find the one that feels good too. And if all we do is what's the boring, most stupid way? Not stupid. It just, I don't know. I find it a little bit soulless. And my God, if nothing else, Scala has some soul. That's why it's still here. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about how we've been able to do that at Zalando, because I'm pretty proud of this. In 2015, we made a big change, and in particular, we changed how we sort of thought at a very high level about how to architect systems. We introduced some architectural principles, and there's two of them in particular that have turned out to be really, really helpful in making sure that we have an ecosystem where we can keep trying new technology. And, do we want to keep trying new technology forever? Kind of, yes. But at the same time, there's a natural kind of 80-20 rule that starts to settle down, and there's a few things that really, really work. And, in the past, that was Java for us, and more over the past 3 years, that's been Scala, also Postgres. But the first of these is this API-first concept. This is something I pushed several companies in a row. It never stuck anywhere until Zalando. It is a completely sort of obvious idea from a good software engineering practices point of view, but it was incredibly exhilarating to see this actually take hold and to really understand what it enables. more companies are doing this now. There's pretty good tooling around it. But somehow this architectural decision of separating implementation from interface and really treating interface development as a first-class activity is probably the highest leverage thing I've ever seen any company do in terms of really enabling scale and diversity without compromise. And, we've written a lot about it on our tech blog. We've open sourced a lot of tooling around it. If you're building kind of a service-based environment, I could not recommend more strongly that you look at this approach. There are a few different variants for how to do it. There's no real standardization on what's the right kind of meta language for this. But in terms of really changing people's behavior, it just simply works. And your customers will appreciate having this kind of uniformity and well-thought-throughness to APIs. People have been saying for 10 or 15 years, APIs are huge. They really are huge now, finally. And so if you're not doing this, you should, in part because it makes it possible to give teams more autonomy around what tools they use. It doesn't really matter what's behind the API. If the API is agnostic around the technology, if people want to use Scala, they can use Scala. If they want to use Haskell, they can use Haskell. It is somehow, compared to how we did things for a long time, which was lots of shared libraries and increasing kind of binary coupling over time, this is a huge deal. And the other I'm embarrassed to put up here in 2018 because, my God, are we not sick of this topic yet? But microservices is also a super key part of this. Part of taking risks around technology it goes in hand with trying to keep things small. So when you make a mistake, you can actually fix that mistake. There's a ton of good reasons to use microservices. This is not that talk. And it is a little bit overhyped. But it's overhyped because it is a really good idea for a bunch of different reasons. And one of those is that it lets you keep evolving your tech stack. And however great, whatever tools you are using now, in 5 or 10 years, it's not going to be that easy to hire super great people who know how to do that or want to do that. And so you need to build this flexibility in, and that's one of the great advantages of using microservices, especially with API first, that people don't really talk about. It makes the technology choice less critical, and that is important. Hinging too much on a technology bet is a bad long-term play. So we made these, we put these kind of like architectural cornerstones in place and stood back to see what would happen. And we heard horror stories about some other companies, one of them in Berlin, going a little bit overboard on the let's use every single Hacker News recommended technology that we can think of. And so we needed some way to introduce some notion of governance. And so we adopted the ThoughtWorks Tech Radar approach, and we open sourced it. And it's actually generated a lot of interest externally. Maybe you've seen it. If you go, we have a booth set up. I think there's even the Tech Radar set up there. You can have a look. ThoughtWorks, very smart. I think what we've done is also quite smart. It's, mostly stealing from them, but really adopting to how do you make these kind of technology decisions in a company in a sane way? And how do you decide, is this the right moment, to do this in Erlang or not? Or, how do we avoid unintentionally having the entire company run down a wrong path? So there, it is, at the end of the day, a set of recommendations that it would be local to a company around this is a technology that we have a lot of expertise in-house in. This is a technology that we don't. And here's some guidelines about how we want to introduce new technologies in. For example, at Zalando, we prefer just one team to do it first and report back, not have like a bunch of teams all deciding it was a mistake. But this is a lightweight form of governance that is very high leverage. And I think the amount of interest we get through having open sourced indicates to me that it's really quite interesting. So I would recommend that you have a look. Because unless you are working for a company that has just fully drunk the Scala Kool-Aid, in which case, congratulations, have fun. As you get bigger, that just gets harder. It's not the perfect tool for every problem, but having a culture where reasonable decisions can be made through a consensus process about where we want to go and where we don't, and especially how to take risks, is a key part of what makes a company a great place to be for people like us. Okay. The third thing I want to talk about is autonomy. In 2015, we rolled out this big event called Radical Agility, where we really pivoted the entire tech org of Zalando away from a very command and control, very structured, and kind of unfulfilling place to be, to one that we could really scale, and where we could continue to attract great people. And we set off on this kind of big adventure to figure out how to do that. We embraced these three ideas, popularized by Dan Pink, around how to really keep people engaged and how to basically motivate smart people. And the first of those is really try to get down to the purpose of things. To be honest, our success in the early days was based on one person who was very good at saying, you do this, 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 you do this. And all of those thises were pretty smart at the time. But there wasn't a lot of creativity for the people on the receiving end of those instructions. And as things get more complicated, no one person is smart enough to do that consistently. It just doesn't scale. It also kind of sucks. I think all the people who were there, or at least the ones that I know, have some form of PTSD from that experience, a minor form. But it was pretty real. And what's interesting about giving people purpose is that it can unleash creativity in them. And this is also connected to this Simon Sinek concept of start with why. But really, it's like we don't know it for the same reason that waterfall planning is kind of stupid. We just don't know at the start what we're going to know. And so if people have in mind either that they know why they're doing it, or at least that if they don't know why, they should ask, it's somehow kind of a secret to scaling and a secret for really making work more fulfilling for everybody. And it turns it into problem solving rather than just doing tasks. And it also sort of fosters this end-to-end ownership concept. The second big principle from Dan Pink is around autonomy, and this is pretty well known at this point. A lot of people have talked about autonomous teams. People even regularly try to hire me because they have set up autonomous teams and it's gone terribly wrong. But basically everybody likes the idea of I can make these decisions and live with the outcome. And then people who actually run businesses love the idea of unleashing the parallelism of autonomous teams. It somehow just feels great for everybody. It feels like we can get more done. It's just super hard to actually do in practice. And then the third Dan Pinkism is around mastery. So we're all learning all the time. Learning happens through books, and it happens through actually doing and making mistakes. One of my favorite lines around this is that good judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from poor judgment. You got to set it up so people can screw up. And that affects how you build systems, and it affects how you do your culture, and it also affects how you kind of give people just the time and space to learn something new on a regular basis. And if you don't, especially with introverts, as people become an increasingly bigger fish in an increasingly smaller pond, they actually become less confident about their abilities. If you spend a decade being an iOS developer, you might start to think that's the only developer that you could ever be. And in fact, that's probably not true. And so having this kind of mindset of we really want people to learn new things really does genuinely make them better. But oh my God, there's a dark side to all of this. And it's especially around autonomy. So when we rolled out autonomy, we basically said, okay, we all believe very strongly, it was another kind of kumbaya moment, that these are how we want to run this kind of org, but we have no idea really how to lead it yet, but we're just going to like jump in and figure it out as we go. And so we granted teams all of this autonomy right from the start. And I mean, it wasn't totally stupid. We wanted to get away from a very regimented way of building software. We had a very strict tool set. We wanted to start, the people who are working at home using some other language, we would rather say that they'd use that language at work rather than go find a job somewhere else. So it felt like this amazing moment of empowerment, but what we got was a little bit more Lord of the Flies in some cases. It was a spectrum, or a bell curve, as I like to say, but it was somehow not knowing how to lead this stuff was pretty tricky. And we had essentially made one huge glaring fundamental error in how we did this, and it's that we treated autonomy as a gift instead of a reward. Autonomy is not a reasonable input to a team. You can't just say, here you go, we're injecting you with autonomy. They have to learn it and they have to earn it. And it's a spectrum, and some teams are amazing at it and some teams are not. And part of what leaders have to do is understand the context and the situation and do the right thing. And we saw some really great stuff, we saw some really depressing stuff. It was the full spectrum of outcomes. But pretty early we figured out that we had maybe made a little bit of a mistake, and it took some time to fix it. And for me, I was pretty far on this journey when I saw this tweet about a year ago from Kent Beck, which I absolutely love. It is such a succinct way to put it. And what we had missed was that basically accountability is like the mathematical dual of autonomy. You cannot reasonably reason about autonomy if you don't have some kind of accountability system in place. And at the end of the day, accountability, it means that you have to own the shit. And that was missing somehow in this. Now the thing about accountability is, it's actually another word I, for a long time, hated to say. Like governance, it was a little hard to get it off my tongue. I wasn't quite sure why. It went against some kind of rebel DNA in me. And I always associated it with accounting, which is not really something I'm good at. And it just seemed like it was all about the money. And I've really, it's like I like to have a healthy respect for the money part, but it can't be the driving thing if you want to lead a rich and fulfilling life. But through this process, it's like, okay, we need to understand what this is. We had a very uncomfortable moment when I realized that none of us actually knew what's the difference between responsibility and accountability. And that was pretty embarrassing because we certainly should have known. In case you don't know, responsibility can be shared, accountability cannot. Accountability really does come down to an individual. But what we've tried to do is understand accountability in a way that makes sense for people who do what we do. And I think there's three key parts. The first part of accountability is that you have to be committed to what you're doing. If you're not actually committed, like running around in a horse mask in a hurricane, that's pretty committed. Maybe not healthy, but if you are not enthusiastic about what you're doing, if you haven't found a way over this kind of mental hump, even if it's something kind of boring, then you're not committed. My very first job, I had a boss who worked on the Amiga, and I was just like, oh my God, that's the coolest thing ever, and tell me all about it. And then I said, what did you work on after that? And he said he worked on medical record document processing applications. And I kind of like, my face fell and I lost interest in the conversation. And he gave me this look that I'll never forget, where he's like, what you haven't figured out yet is that you can make any technical challenge interesting if you look at it in the right way. And that for me was definitely a growing moment. It took some time for that to sink in. But this is related to commitment, and it's related to what it means to be mature as a professional, to actually be able to say, okay, this is important to somebody. There's a customer here that matters, and I'm going to be committed and even excited about this. And maybe it's easy, maybe it's hard, but at the end of the day, there might be a choice, and that's part of what being accountable means. Transparency is also a necessary ingredient to being accountable. So this is like the accountability that's not accounting, but it's like give the account. What's the story? What are you doing? What are your plans? What are your goals? What is your progress? If you are not part of some system where that's discussed, you're not really accountable. And I used to hate that stuff. I mean, I used to joke that there was a Yahoo group for project managers who had to work with me. It was so hard to get nailed down on any of this stuff. And I look back, I wasted so much time by just typing instead of actually trying to think a little bit higher. What do we want to achieve here? How are we going to know when we're done? And how can we be part of a bigger system? Yes, 3 programmers can change the world, but not as fast as 3,000. And so this transparency is absolutely essential. And related to that is this idea of being open to evaluation. What was the outcome? What were the consequences? What did we learn? How does this contribute to our mastery? And this is the feedback loop that's so key, because no one ever got better at anything without feedback. And that's why people talk about feedback cultures and all this stuff. You know, you can maybe get a little bit better, but nobody ever actually got great. There has to be this honesty about this is what happened, this is what we learned, this is what we're doing. And this is the final piece of this system that can drive autonomy into a working state. If you can be trusted because you can actually be honest about what you're doing and how it's going and demonstrate over time that your decisions make sense, it's just like thermodynamics. You will be trusted. People don't have the energy to pay attention to the things where they know what the answer is going to be. Everything here is fine. There are challenges, we're overcoming them. And that's where autonomy comes from. That's how you get it. Now, one of the things that makes this super hard is that, you know, there's a million things that can cause us to fail. There's so many dependencies, things outside our control, and it's very often structural. And this is another place where system theory comes in because, you know, you build, like, you know, I'm not really a fan of holacracy because I think hierarchies are a very useful data structure. There are hard decisions that have to be made. The conversations involving lots of people never resolve. Hierarchies are useful if for no other reason that you can reduce the number of people in the conversation and make a decision that that group is accountable for. But what happens is it's kind of nice to be at the top of a hierarchy, and the hierarchy starts to just serve the existence of the hierarchy. And so what we learn from system theory is that for all of this to work, we have to take a very flexible view of what the structure actually is to succeed. That means pulling people together into, you know, heterogeneous groups that can solve problems end to end so that they have less to blame. Fewer things outside their domain of control. Something's stopping you, own it, pull it in. Don't fall victim to Conway's law. Now, for many of you, it's not really within your power to just say, okay, we're going to change the whole structure of this thing, but you can be part of the thinking behind that. You can push for that, and you can start to take ownership. You can start to adapt. So, you have to own it. And somehow, the one thing that seems to start people on this journey is to go through this process of owning. What is the thing that can cause me to fail? What is the one thing outside my domain of control right now which I could blame failure on? So I'd like to ask you to take out your phone. Pretty sure most of you have a phone. Open up Twitter. If you say you don't have Twitter, I don't believe you. And I want you to think for a minute about one thing that you currently don't have any control over that could cause you to fail. And I want you to tweet that with the hashtag owntheshit. And that somehow is some tiny little force to start to pull the world around you into a shape where you can start to take accountability. And when you put all of this stuff together, not only can you love the tools that you work with and love the people that you work with, but you can also succeed at what you're doing. Pull the stuff together and own it. I'll wait. Did you tweet? Do you need another minute? So I have to say, my favorite part of this is going and reading the tweets. So I've stood up here for an hour. I deserve some tweets. Okay, so let me leave you with this. Also good to say about love that it doesn't dominate, it cultivates. And so for Scala to continue to cultivate in a highly competitive world where, there are a lot of good ideas, a lot of competing technologies, and a lot of misunderstanding about what's actually important. We have to understand how it fits into systems, and what are the systems that we need that can build this kind of meritocracy so that it can emerge on its own merits. We have to have the governance systems in place that can really support and drive people making the right decisions, not on behalf of everyone, but on behalf of their shit. And then we have to be accountable for the decisions that we make and what we build and what is the outcome of those decisions. And we can't be held back by what somebody else is letting us down. We got to own the shit. Thanks.